So, and yeah, that's to kind of jump into the pre-game show here. See, reading this week, been revisiting this guy, Robert Penn Warren. He was one of the three poets whose work featured significantly in my master's thesis, as a matter of fact. Him, James Wright, and James Dickey, all poets, very modern poets, very crucial to my the development of my aesthetic, in conjunction with the Old English language and that spread of poets anonymous and lost to history outside of King Alfred. Yeah, so revisiting Robert Penn Warren, he just does, this guy does murder so well. Not just, and I'm not talking like fireworks and sort of like action and that sort of thing, but just like an environment and a landscape that is rife with danger and death, and it's a more romantic version of what Cormac McCarthy is able to accomplish. Good evening, Arx. Good to see you. And I love it for that. I think that Cormac McCarthy, to be clear, does some very fine work in his darkness. Robert Penn Warren is more interested in reconciling that darkness not with the sort of eternal now of sort of an existential reality, but with history and time and the passage of it and what it means to be human and alive. And so for that, I love it, and I'm looking forward to revisiting more of it. The movie this week that I watched and kind of I've been enjoying digging a little more deeply into this stuff. It's good. It's called Orochi, Orochi. Evening, Iceman Dan. Yes, I love McCarthy's Darkness too. And if you like Cormac McCarthy, I will recommend Robert Penn Warren, who is a precursor to him. And there's some overlapping. They were working around the same time, but I think Warren is a little older. Warren was our first poet laureate in the America United States. This is how you call that nation. Yeah, I wouldn't call it lighter exactly. Maybe I don't know. It's less. It's more. God, it's hard. I'm gonna have to think about how to describe that distinction. That's a really good question. I'll think about that for next time. But yeah, so Orochi, which is a 1925 Jidaigeki movie, and stars. Let's see. Tsumasaburo Bondo, excuse me, and he was one of the early sort of superstars, film stars of sort of Japanese cinema, and yeah, this is a lovely movie. Let's see, I kind of left it in the middle of, I'm getting a preview of everything that I'm going to look at here, but that's fine, because this is not a super formal thing. Back, I did not realize that when you close the thing out, it keeps your place. So we're going back in time to better days for our hero. And yeah, so this is kind of a riches to rags story. Though I wouldn't exactly call him in a position of riches. He's sort of at the beginning of his career and his life as a samurai, and just through a series of misfortunes, the guy just winds up becoming an outlaw, becoming a criminal, and dying a criminal's death. Even though sort of what's on his side of his story plus what's in his heart is completely different from what people are seeing of him. So kind of he starts to go downhill. This noble son picks a fight with him, and he takes the bait because he's young and hot-headed. That's probably his biggest character flaw. Is he's a little too reactive. So he picks a fight, gets cast out, becomes a Ronin. You can see him there with the infinity of the sea before him, the unknown fate that awaits him, and donning his straw hat. And as a Ronin, it's not one of the more romanticized versions of this life. He's very much itinerant, homeless. Only pair of clothes are starting to become more ragged. He is growing his stubble, and then gets into another scrape, gets thrown in jail, breaks out of jail, falls into the wrong crowd, so here he is as a bodyguard on the wrong side of a conflict, goes back to jail, breaks out, and here you have some nice sort of vignetting around the edges here, kind of suggesting the clandestine nature of his mission to branch out. That's kind of a nice stylistic touch to kind of reinforce what's happening in the story. And then he gets taken in his desperation by a lord who he later finds out kidnaps and sells people as a human trafficker, and he sort of despairs that the only way to maintain any kind of material existence in this world is to ally with people who themselves are evil, and then just can't take it anymore, turns against the guy, fights a ton of people, because all people see is he is fighting against a legitimate lord, not knowing, what that guy's sort of line of business is. And so the authorities are just fighting him into some massive sword fight. And at the end, he accepts death as the only outcome for a just man in an unjust society. So this is kind of a downward arc, and it doesn't really end on a happy note. But yeah, it's this is interesting because it's like the way that it's telling its story is like really hitting realism. It's not about sort of ennobling an idea. It's not sort of like ennobling goodness by pairing it with success, right? Goodness and a sympathetic character are absolutely bound to failure and defeat because of the nature of the society that it's found in. Is that sort of thing. Oh yeah, it's super bleak. But there's sort of there is an optimistic edge to it that is sort of metatextual and not in the thing itself. But and that's kind of one of the things that's interesting to me about this, is that so like Bando was one of the first like sort of realistic actors in the if you see like the fight scene here, which these are just all fantastic Jidaigeki fight scenes with swords and sort of judo throws and stuff like that, and it's a lot of fun. And they're all these like older, just like one sustained long shot affairs, and it's probably maintains some of the dignity of the actors, because you probably don't see them get hit and wince, because these are just like brawls that they're filming. And but yeah, so what's interesting about this is that Bando, like, he was one of like the first realistic actors that this sort of sword fighting, this sort of like brawl sword fighting was very new. And it's sort of like it's developed in contrast to kabuki theater, which was a very closed system of performance. And so you have a bunch of people, you have a lot of actors who are trained actors who are good at what they do, but because kabuki is sort of closed off because of the sort of dynastic nature of the actors and the performers, they go to film. And there's this sort of real raw energy that comes out in a lot of these movies, which is sort of one of the things that samurai movies are known for, right? The sort of like period film sort of aggression and the sword fights, and that comes like as a push on this like sort of like younger up and coming generation on this system of acting that has shut them out. And they sort of adopt a kind of a Hollywood realism here, this sort of swashbuckling feel, and yeah, and it's also like, the style is connected to which way am I going? There we go. It's also connected with socialism in a way that I was not expecting when I was doing some additional research on this, which is that sort of like the traditional stories sort of like ennoble the samurai, uphold the Bushido virtues, and show the goodness of that way of living and that way of society. And these movies that are sort of starting to really emphasize Ronins as rebels against an order, that also sort of coincides with the influx of socialism into kind of pre-World War II Japan. And it's a rejection of social hierarchy. So these are very much like these movies, even though they take place in sort of these traditional settings, are themselves sort of like rejections of tradition. And also there's sort of a meta commentary there that sort of like the egalitarianism that you want to access the art of your choice by being allowed in by the people who are gatekeepers. That's not allowed to them. So that sort of overlaps with the broader access to society goals that they have. And it's also interesting to me because that very much connects with how a lot of artists, both in the US and also in Japan, got into the video game industry, because a lot of times those artists came from animation backgrounds, and in the sort of like mid-late 20th century, there was just kind of like an influx of a lot of animators, a lot of artists, and there were just too many of them for employment, and so they went into video games sort of as a fallback, and film was kind of the video game fallback for actors at the time of its origination. So that's kind of a neat repeated pattern there. But yeah, and so what connects to Killer 7 tonight is one of the ways the film does tell its story, and this is super interesting to me. This hits me where I live. And so the realism, regardless of the sword fights, there's like this blurring of presentation and story, and it comes through in some of the narration. These were silent films, so the way that they narrated their story is there was like basically somebody who had like an audiobook role called a benshi, and they would just narrate the story. They would provide the voices for the characters, so even though it wasn't a talkie, you still got some of that talkie feel to it. And every time a new character is addressed in the narration itself, it introduces the actor who is playing him, and playing him or her, and so it's really interesting. It's like the presentation and the story, they're just fine collapsing the two. And visually they do the same thing as well, and that's what makes this really interesting as a film. There are several instances where, of course, in silent film style, there's text over black to kind of connect one scene to the other, and there's these few moments where they do this very strange thing, like here, right? There's this sort of woven reed background as the lettering shows up, and the background shows up to distinguish the lettering from the previous scene. But then as it goes on, it's like, let's see, there we go, yeah. It's like the reed background stays and the movie continues behind it, and it's this weird liminal space, and it's a transitional moment in the story. It's like this liminal space between narration and presentation and the story itself, and that's super cool to me. The narration introduces the actors by literally by saying like, and here comes and here comes Joe, played by Akira Kobayashi. It's like those are two actor names pulled straight out of my head and not in this movie, but that's an example where like the narrator will actually just say that instead of leaving it to the viewer to show up early and see the credits, and I think that's neat. Yeah, no, they just put it out there. It's a good time. It's a big story party, so they do these things where it's like it flattens the screen. It basically takes the narration, combines it with the presentation, and there's not a separation between the two. And the most interesting version of this, the most interesting moment where this happens, is when he is at his absolute lowest. They use the lettering and the format of the Silent Hill, I keep wanting to say Silent Hill, of the silent films sort of placards, and they superimpose it over him. So like the word there, the word of the narration is expressing his anxiety or concern. So rather than even like a full sentence showing up, it's just the word money. and it kind of hovers over him for a little bit, kind of winks out to black and goes away. And then it does that again immediately after, where I've got to find work somewhere. So it's using this format to kind of like go into his perspective and pull that out, and it uses the narration style of silent film to do that, and that's really fascinating to me. Yeah, no, Freudian slip. This is, well, I mean, if you're talking about form and content, Silent Hill is absolutely your jam, because that's James's anxieties manifesting as monsters. That's exactly what that is, right? And that's why that's interesting to me, especially in relation to Killer 7. Is this is an instance where the presentation and the story are not separate things, right? The presentation is the story, the style is also substance, and that absolutely relates to Killer 7. And it's also one of the reasons why I kind of don't use the style-substance dichotomy myself a whole lot. It's a little more of an overly analytic way of, like, you can sort of overlook form as a meaningful way of organizing content. You can overlook form and dismiss it as style in distinction from substance. And when you do that, you sort of strip away from a piece of art one of the things that makes it uniquely that, right? Kind of like one of the catch-alls about poetry is that if you can summarize it and it's the same experience, it's not a good poem. Style is form, and that's also where it connects to that other obsession of mine, which is poetry, which is that the way that a poem is organized, the way that it is presented, is identical with what it is presenting. And that is absolutely true with this kind of film technique, and it is absolutely true with Killer 7. And that's kind of a thought that I like bringing into this stream as a way of looking at that game. Good evening, Mirth. It's good to see you. Thank you. I appreciate that. I have sort of been experimenting with these the past several weeks, and some folks have said that they like them, and some folks have been silent, so I'm just continuing to enjoy it. Yes, Iceman Dan, same. And that's one of the things that actually the continuation of that, and the continuation of that comfort of being comfortable with that, using presentation and style to tell the story. That appears to have continued in Japanese cinema more so than it does in Hollywood and many other European styles. I think French cinema and German cinema also keep quite a bit of this as they go on, but this is a way of telling a story that is very close to my heart, and so seeing it pursued so consistently is very refreshing to me. And yeah, and the one last thing that I thought was kind of neat, that's kind of on a Metal Gear note. So there's this scene where he's fighting and he gets captured, and I found out that this thing here, this is called a Torinawa, a capture rope, which I'm not sure if they were ever deployed. This is the word I'm looking for. I'm not sure if they were ever deployed this massively at once. This is a beautiful, beautiful shot with beautiful composition. Really great negative space down there in the lower left with all the swords scattered around, showing all the people that he's slain or disarmed, and the police have got him all tied up. And so it's a very big visual, very dynamic and compelling. And I was like, where have I seen this before? And I remembered this is really badly formatted, but again, this is a super informal thing. This right here with our friend Raiden, who was snagged by the Metal Gear Gecko, and I'm wondering if there's I don't know, something maybe familiar about that particular setup that made its way into this visual here as Raiden is captured and about to be sliced up by Vamp. And just real quick, just to call attention to this is one of the things that Kojima is very good at for visual composition. Really good at taking those power lines and those shadows and just overlapping them with the wires. So even if you can't see the wires, you still get the overall abstract impression of binding, which is exactly Raiden's situation. So just a lot of really great stuff there, and somebody who has definitely internalized good instincts for a lot of movies. Oh yes, I will. I'll be continuing this segment of the streams. Thank you. I appreciate that encouragement. Let's see. So that brings us to Killer 7. And